Lucas hesitated for a moment, his small hands twisting in his lap. Then he mumbled, "I'm sorry." The words were soft, almost swallowed by the hum of the plane, but they landed with weight. Dr. Carter studied him for a moment before nodding. "I appreciate that." Across the aisle, passengers exchanged glances, sensing something had shifted. Rebecca sat rigid, her arms crossed, her face a storm of unreadable emotions. But Lucas? He was different now. He had been seen. As the plane descended, Dr. Carter exhaled deeply, feeling, for the first time in hours, the weight in his chest begin to lift. Sometimes, the lesson isn't for the parents. It's for the child who's still learning what's right. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this? Tell us below. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And now, let's dive into this fascinating story together. Sometimes, the smallest moments reveal the deepest truths about who we are. And on Flight 327 from Dallas to Seattle, one moment changed everything. Dr. Anthony Carter sat in seat 14A, the cool leather pressing against his back as he adjusted the cuffs of his slate gray blazer. The tightness in his shoulders wasn't from the long work trip, though his schedule had been punishing, but from the sheer exhaustion of being constantly measured, constantly watched. He reached into his leather carry-on, pulling out his tablet, his sanctuary. A neurosurgeon at the peak of his career, Dr. Carter had spent the past 3 days at a medical conference, delivering a keynote on minimally invasive brain surgery. He should have felt accomplished, proud even, but right now, all he wanted was silence. He glanced at his Rolex, its sapphire crystal catching the cabin lights. For hours until Seattle, just long enough to review notes for his next procedure. A deep breath. He just needed peace. The cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight chaos. Muted conversations, overhead bins slamming shut, the shuffle of passengers settling into their seats. Across the aisle, a young couple whispered in hushed tones, pointing at something on a phone screen. A few rows ahead, a toddler let out a high-pitched wail before being hushed by an already exhausted mother. A flight attendant, her crisp navy blue uniform immaculate, moved gracefully down the aisle, her professional smile never faltering as she checked overhead compartments. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 327, with service from Dallas to Seattle. Please fasten your seat belts and ensure your tray tables are in the upright position." Dr. Carter exhaled, feeling the tension in his neck loosen just slightly. He'd been on enough flights to know how to tune out the world, to find comfort in the in-between moments. He glanced to his right. Seat 14B was still empty, a small mercy. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. The last of the passengers were filing in now, their movements hurried, their voices tinged with the impatience of travelers just wanting to be somewhere else. And then, "Ethan, stay right behind Daddy, please." A blur of motion, a harried-looking woman, blonde hair escaping from a messy bun, guided 2 children down the aisle. Dr. Carter barely glanced up. Another family, another routine flight. Then, thump, a sharp kick to the back of his seat. His jaw clenched, but he didn't turn around. A child, probably. An accident. Then, thump, thump, thump. Dr. Carter's grip tightened around his tablet. The mother, Rebecca Mitchell, slid into the middle seat behind him, sighing as she settled her purse at her feet. Her husband, Greg, took the window seat. Their son, Ethan, about 8 years old, plopped into the seat directly behind Dr. Carter. Another kick, harder this time. Dr. Carter closed his eyes, counted to 3. Surely, the mother would say something. "Ethan, honey, keep your feet down," Rebecca murmured distractedly, already flipping to the pages of a magazine. The kicking didn't stop. Thump. Dr. Carter inhaled through his nose, exhaled slowly. His fingers hovered over the Do Not Disturb setting on his tablet. Thump. He shifted in his seat, hoping, praying, the kid would take the hint. Thump, thump, thump. His pulse ticked up, his breathing measured. Not yet. Don't react yet. A single thought settled in his mind, one he knew all too well. If I say something, will I be the problem? Lucas let out a sharp giggle, the kind that made Dr. Carter's stomach tighten. The boy wasn't just restless, he was entertained. Another kick landed squarely against the back of the seat, the jolt traveling up Dr. Carter's spine. He exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, keeping his eyes locked on his tablet screen, as if sheer willpower alone could block out the irritation crawling under his skin. "Lucas, honey, stop that," Rebecca murmured without looking up, her voice absent of any real authority. The boy's foot still for precisely 3 seconds. Then, thump, Dr. Carter's jaw clenched. Another soft laugh, this time more of a testing chuckle, as if Lucas knew exactly what he was doing. The boy wasn't just moving his legs out of habit. He was playing a game, and Dr. Carter was his unwitting opponent. The weight of frustration sat heavy in his chest, but he didn't turn around. He knew better. He had spent years perfecting the art of measured patience, of swallowing irritation in spaces where his reactions would be scrutinized. A black man showing even the slightest sign of anger in a confined space with mostly white passengers? That was a game he had no interest in playing. Greg sat by the window, phone in hand, scrolling with the relaxed indifference of a man oblivious to the world around him. He hadn't acknowledged the kicking once, hadn't glanced up to see if his son was disturbing someone. Dr. Carter shifted slightly, angling his body away from the impact zone, trying to create some distance, some barrier between himself and the boy's relentless drumming. But it didn't matter. Lucas's legs, small but persistent, pressed forward again. Thump. A muscle flickered in Dr. Carter's jaw. The cabin was settling into the quiet hum of mid-flight. The murmurs of passengers had faded, replaced by the occasional clink of a drink cart rolling down the aisle, the soft rustling of snack bags being opened, the distant drone of the engines. But here, in seat 14A, there was no peace. Dr. Carter pressed his fingers into his temples, inhaling deeply. He could already see how this would play out if he said something. Rebecca would offer another half-hearted correction. Lucas would pretend to stop. And 5 minutes later, the game would resume. Thump. His grip tightened around his tablet. Thump. The noise wasn't even the worst part. It was the fact that the mother knew. She knew and she didn't care. The father didn't care. And why should they? Their world did not require them to be aware of others in the same way his world did. Thump. Lucas giggled again, and the sound crawled under Dr. Carter's skin. He had been patient. He had given them a chance to handle it on their own. But patience had its limits. This time he would say something. Bam! The kick was harder this time, so forceful that Dr. Carter's tray table trembled, knocking over the plastic cup of water resting beside his tablet. The cold liquid splashed across the screen, the droplets scattering over the digital notes he'd been reviewing. His hands moved instinctively, snatching the device up before the water could seep into the cracks. A sharp breath hissed through his teeth as he grabbed a napkin from the seat pocket, dabbing at the screen, frustration boiling beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Behind him, Lucas let out a delighted giggle. Dr. Carter's fingers still for a moment, the weight of that laughter pressing against his chest. It wasn't nervous or apologetic. It was triumphant. The child knew exactly what he had done. Rebecca sighed, as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "Lucas, sweetie, I told you to be careful." That was it. No firm reprimand. No real acknowledgement of the disruption. Just a flimsy suggestion wrapped in the same half-hearted tone she'd used before. Greg still hadn't looked up from his phone. A flicker of heat sparked at the back of Dr. Carter's neck. He had spent years cultivating restraint, knowing that his responses were always judged differently, knowing that even justified irritation could be misinterpreted as aggression. He had learned, as all black men in predominantly white spaces had, to weigh every reaction. But this was pushing it. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Rebecca's, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Ma'am, your son just knocked over my drink." Rebecca blinked at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. She glanced at the spilled water, then at Lucas, then back at Dr. Carter, her expression hovering somewhere between mild annoyance and dismissal. "Oh, well, it's just water, right?" Just water. Just an inconvenience. Just another moment where her family's comfort mattered more than his. A murmur rippled through the nearby rows. Other passengers had seen what happened. Some glanced over with brief flickers of sympathy, but none spoke up. None of them wanted to get involved. Lucas swung his legs again, the tips of his sneakers barely grazing the back of Dr. Carter's seat, testing, waiting to see if there would be a reaction. His smirk was small but unmistakable. Dr. Carter exhaled slowly, forcing the tension from his shoulders. "I need him to stop," he said, his voice low but firm. Rebecca's brows lifted, a hint of indignation creeping into her expression. "I said I told him to be careful." "You asked him, and he didn't listen," Dr. Carter countered, holding her gaze. "I'm asking you to make sure it doesn't happen again." The conversation was quiet, but the weight of it pressed against the cabin air. A few rows up, an older man in a business suit shifted in his seat. Across the aisle, a young woman wearing earbuds slid one out, pretending not to listen but clearly tuned in. Greg finally sighed and put his phone down, rubbing a hand over his face. "Lucas, buddy, just chill out, okay?" Lucas pouted, arms crossing. "I am chill," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter studied the parents for another second, reading the dynamics between them, the reluctance in Rebecca's body language, the performative exasperation in Greg's. They weren't used to being held accountable. Fine, if they wouldn't take responsibility. Someone else would. Dr. Carter turned back to his seat, but this wasn't over. Not yet. Dr. Carter turned around slowly, his movements measured, deliberate. He had given them every opportunity to handle this on their own. They had failed. Now, he would make sure there was no room for misunderstanding. Lucas sat slouched in his seat, one arm draped lazily over the armrest, his small legs still hovering dangerously close to the back of Dr. Carter's chair. His expression didn't hold the awkward guilt of a child who had made a mistake. There was no hesitation, no nervous flicker in his wide blue eyes. Just defiance. Dr. Carter met his gaze, his voice calm but sharp as a scalpel. "Could you please stop?" For a second, silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, the kind of silence that made nearby passengers hold their breath. Then Lucas smirked. "No." The single syllable landed like a slap. Dr. Carter's fingers curled against the armrest. He wasn't surprised. Not really, but something about hearing it spoken out loud, with such casual boldness, sent a pulse of heat through his chest. The sheer audacity of it, the unshaken confidence of a boy who had clearly never been told no in a way that mattered. Rebecca gasped softly, reaching over to touch Lucas's arm. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice tight with sudden awareness that this was no longer just an inconvenience. This was an audience. Lucas didn't look at her. He didn't need to. His message had already been delivered. Across the aisle, a businessman cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. A young woman with dark curls tucked behind her ear angled her body slightly toward the scene, pretending to scroll through her phone but clearly listening. The flight had been background noise up until now. But this moment, this was something they would all remember. Greg sighed heavily from the window seat, but still didn't bother turning around. "Lucas, just stop messing around," he muttered. It wasn't a command. It was a suggestion, and an empty one at that. Dr. Carter studied the parents, the way they hesitated, the way they waited for this moment to pass without consequence. He exhaled slowly, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he turned back around. They weren't going to stop this. They weren't going to fix it, which meant someone else would have to. Elena Vasquez had seen a lot in her 12 years as a flight attendant. Drunken arguments, entitled passengers snapping their fingers for service, tense moments between strangers forced into tight spaces. But this was different. From the moment she stepped into the cabin, she felt a shift in the air. A subtle but undeniable tension clung to the rows around 14A. It was in the way passengers sat a little too still, in the way their eyes flicked toward Dr. Carter, then quickly away. She had been keeping an eye on that row ever since she first noticed the boy kicking the seat. At first, it had seemed like the usual restlessness of a child confined for too long. But then she saw the way his mother responded, light, dismissive, unwilling to truly correct him. And worse, she saw the way Dr. Carter sat, rigid, unmoving, as if forcing himself to shrink into his seat. That was the part that bothered her the most. Passengers got annoyed all the time. A sigh, a glance over the shoulder, a passive-aggressive shift in posture. People always had ways of making their irritation known. But Dr. Carter hadn't done any of that. He had endured it, swallowed it down. Elena had worked with enough people to recognize what that meant. This wasn't just about a kid kicking a seat. This was about who was allowed to be uncomfortable and who was expected to just deal with it. She grabbed a stack of napkins from her cart, making her way down the aisle. As she approached row 14, she caught the tail end of a whispered exchange. The mother hissing Lucas's name, the father's low murmur of, "Just stop messing around." And Dr. Carter, sitting perfectly still, as if willing himself not to react. She crouched slightly beside his seat, her voice warm but firm. "Sir, is everything all right here?" Dr. Carter glanced at her, his expression carefully neutral. A beat of silence passed before he gave a small nod. "Fine, thank you." She wasn't buying it. Not when she had just watched him dab water off his tablet minutes ago. Not when she had seen how not fine he had been this entire time. Her gaze flicked to the boy behind him. Lucas was watching him with mild curiosity, still slouched in his seat like he had all the time in the world. His mother, now hyper-aware of the attention, offered Elena a quick, too-sweet smile. "Everything's fine," Rebecca said, placing a hand on Lucas's knee as if to signal that she had this under control. Elena smiled back, but there was steel behind it. She straightened, tilting her head slightly as if considering something. "Actually, I'd like to offer your son a coloring book or a puzzle. Sometimes a little distraction helps." Lucas groaned. "I don't want to color. That's for babies." Rebecca let out an apologetic chuckle, as if to say, "Kids, right? Oh, he's fine. He just gets a little antsy on long flights." Elena's fingers tightened around the napkins in her hand. That was it? That was the excuse? Her voice didn't change, but her posture did, more direct, more commanding. "I understand, but we need to make sure all passengers are comfortable." Her eyes locked onto Rebecca's for just a moment longer than necessary, letting the weight of her words settle. Rebecca stiffened slightly, shifting in her seat. Greg finally looked up from his phone. But Lucas? Lucas just smiled, as if none of this mattered at all. And that was when Elena realized this wasn't a restless kid. This was a kid testing boundaries, learning in real time what he could get away with. Well, not today. Elena kept her expression composed, her years of experience smoothing over the irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. She had dealt with parents like Rebecca before, the type who believed their child's behavior was everyone else's problem to manage but theirs. She crouched slightly, keeping her voice pleasant but firm. "Lucas, I have some puzzles and activity books up front. Would you like me to bring you one?" Lucas barely looked at her, his chin propped up on his fist. "No." Rebecca chuckled, waving a hand. "Oh, he's fine. He just gets a little antsy on long flights." Elena's lips pressed together, but she didn't let the irritation show. "He's fine?" She stole a glance at Dr. Carter, who still sat completely still, his hands resting on his tablet, like he was forcing himself not to react. This wasn't fine. This was a grown man enduring unnecessary discomfort because no one wanted to do their job as parents. She straightened, adjusting her posture slightly. "I understand," she said smoothly, "but we need to make sure all passengers are comfortable." Her eyes flicked toward Lucas, then back to Rebecca. "If he's feeling restless, switching seats with you or his father might help." Rebecca's smile didn't falter, but Elena could see the tension creeping into her jawline. The mother shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the armrest. "Oh, that won't be necessary." The words came out quick, clipped, an automatic rejection. Not a moment of consideration, not even the illusion of taking responsibility. Elena had seen this before. Rebecca wasn't just dismissing the problem. She was offended that it was even being addressed. Lucas, sensing his mother's resistance, grinned slightly and sank deeper into his seat. The message was clear. He wasn't going to stop. Elena let out a breath through her nose, but she wasn't done. "We do still have a few hours left on the flight," she said evenly. "I'd really like to make sure everyone has an enjoyable experience." Rebecca's eyes flashed, her polite mask slipping for just a second. "I said it's fine," she repeated, her voice just a fraction sharper. Greg, who had been quiet up until now, finally glanced up from his phone. He let out a sigh, rubbing his temple as if all of this were a minor inconvenience. Lucas, bud, let's just keep our feet to ourselves, all right? Lucas shrugged. I wasn't doing anything. Elena felt her patience stretched dangerously thin. She knew this game. The way Greg's voice was bored, not firm. The way Rebecca's whole posture screamed offensive, not corrective. The way Lucas sat there, smug in the knowledge that his parents would never truly hold him accountable. She glanced around at the surrounding rows. Passengers weren't staring directly, but she could feel their awareness. They were listening. They knew, but no one was going to say a thing. Elena inhaled deeply. Fine. If the polite approach wasn't working, it was time for a new strategy, one that Rebecca and Greg wouldn't be able to ignore. Before Elena could say anything else, Lucas struck again. Thump. The force of the kick sent a sharp jolt through Dr. Carter's seat. Harder than before, deliberate, taunting. It wasn't the restless fidgeting of a bored child anymore. It was a test, a challenge. Dr. Carter's fingers tightened around his tablet. He had been patient. He had endured. He had tried to handle this quietly, with grace, with restraint. But this was intentional. A sharp voice cut through the cabin before he could respond. Seriously? Just control your kid. It came from seat 15C, just behind Greg. The man, a middle-aged businessman in a navy suit, salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, had finally reached his breaking point. He shifted in his seat, glaring at Rebecca and Greg with open frustration. The ripple effect was instant. Passengers turned their heads, pretending not to stare, but clearly invested now. A few exchanged knowing glances. A woman across the aisle shook her head slightly. A man 2 rows up let out a low, exasperated sigh. For the first time, Rebecca looked truly uncomfortable. Her spine went rigid, her cheeks flushing as she twisted toward the businessman. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," the man said, adjusting his tie, his expression one of pure exasperation. "We've been listening to that kid kick the seat for the last hour, and you've done nothing." Rebecca's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Her eyes darted to Greg, but he stayed silent, suddenly far more interested in the in-flight magazine than the confrontation brewing beside him. And then she exploded. "He's just a child," she snapped, her voice higher now, sharper, laced with fury. "He's an 8-year-old boy on a long flight. I'm sorry if that bothers you, but maybe you should learn some patience." The businessman scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, we should learn patience? The guy in front of your son has been patient for hours." His gaze flicked toward Dr. Carter, who still hadn't said a word. "Maybe it's time you did your job as a parent." Rebecca's face burned red, her eyes narrowing. "Are you seriously trying to tell me how to raise my child?" Dr. Carter exhaled slowly, gripping the armrest, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion car crash. This was exactly why he had hesitated to say anything. This was why. The second someone called him out, Rebecca's entitlement flared like an open flame, twisting the narrative, making herself the victim. Elena, still standing beside them, felt the shift too. The exact moment when this stopped being about a child behavior and became about a white woman feeling attacked. She had seconds to stop this before it escalated even further. Her voice came smooth, professional, unwavering. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, addressing Rebecca directly, "I understand that traveling with children can be challenging, but we need to find a solution that works for everyone." Rebecca's eyes snapped to her. "What is this? Some policy now." Greg finally sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "Beck, I got this," she snapped at him, then turned back to Elena. "We're trying, okay? What else do you want from us?" Elena held her gaze, unflinching. "I need Lucas to stop kicking the seat." Silence stretched between them. For a moment, Rebecca looked like she wanted to argue again, to defend, to justify. But then she saw the way people were watching now. Passengers shifting in their seats, eyes flicking between her and Elena, waiting to see how this would play out. For the first time, Rebecca seemed to register that this wasn't just about her anymore. Her fingers twitched on the armrest. A flash of uncertainty passed over her face. Lucas, oblivious of the weight of the moment, rolled his eyes dramatically. Ugh, this is stupid. And that was it. The businessman let out a disbelieving laugh. A woman across the aisle muttered, "Wow." Even Greg, still staring at the magazine he wasn't actually reading, grimaced slightly. Rebecca's entire body stiffened, as if she had just realized that no one was on her side anymore. Elena let the silence settle before she spoke again, lowering her voice just slightly, just enough to make it clear that this was no longer a request. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to need you to switch seats with your son." Elena didn't blink. Her stance remained firm, her voice unwavering. "Enough. Either Lucas stops, or we find another solution." Rebecca's arm snapped across her chest in defiance, her expression a mixture of indignation and forced composure. "What do you want us to do?" The surrounding passengers weren't staring outright, but their awareness pressed in like a suffocating weight. They weren't just witnessing a disagreement anymore. They were waiting to see how it ended. Elena let a slow breath fill her lungs before speaking. "I need one of you to switch seats with him. Now!" Rebecca's mouth twisted, as if Elena had just suggested throwing Lucas out of the plane mid-flight. "Oh, come on. That's ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous," Elena countered. "It's a reasonable compromise to prevent further disruptions." Greg, who had remained entirely uninvolved up until this point, finally let out a long, exaggerated sigh. He set down his magazine as if the weight of the entire situation was personally inconveniencing him. "Beck, just move." Rebecca's eyes snapped toward him, betrayal flashing across her face. "Excuse me." Greg rolled his shoulders, shifting in his seat as if he'd rather be anywhere but here. "We're causing a scene. Just swap seats so we can be done with this." Rebecca's jaw tightened, her gaze flickering between Greg, Lucas, and Elena, her fingers curled against her armrest. "This is absurd," she muttered under her breath, her voice low but venomous. Elena didn't move. She knew that every second of hesitation was only making it worse for Rebecca, making it clearer and clearer that she was the only one fighting back against a solution that made perfect sense. Lucas groaned dramatically. "Mom, just switch already." And that was what finally broke her. Rebecca's face flushed deep red. She sucked in a sharp breath through her nose before snatching off her seatbelt with unnecessary force. She shot Elena a glare so sharp it could have cut through metal, then shoved her purse onto Greg's lap. "Fine," she snapped. "But I hope you all know how completely over the top this is." Passengers exchanged glances, but no one defended her. Lucas grinned as if this was a game he had won, unbuckling himself and flopping dramatically into the middle seat while Rebecca slid stiffly into his place. Elena took a moment, letting the tension settle, making sure this was actually going to stick. Then, finally, she turned toward Dr. Carter. "Sir, I truly apologize for the inconvenience. Can I bring you another water?" Dr. Carter, who had sat through all of it in complete silence, looked her directly in the eyes for the first time. And what she saw there, exhaustion, a deep, quiet, unshaken exhaustion. He gave a small nod, a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'd appreciate that. Thank you." Elena nodded back and turned to leave, but before she could take a step, Lucas, now comfortably wedged between both parents, looked directly at Dr. Carter and muttered, "Cry baby." The moment punched through the cabin like a gunshot. Elena's feet stopped moving. Dr. Carter didn't react. Not at first. A sharp inhale from a woman across the aisle. A deep, barely contained expletive from the businessman behind Greg. Rebecca paled. Greg stiffened. But Lucas? Lucas just sat there, waiting for a reaction. And for a second, a single breathless second, it seemed like Dr. Carter was going to let this go, too. But then, slowly he turned his head. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, controlled, but undeniably sharp. "Tell me something, Lucas. Has anyone ever told you no before?" The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, Lucas's smug expression wavered. He glanced at his mother, his confidence faltering, as if sensing that something in the air had shifted. Dr. Carter didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words cut through the cabin with the precision of a scalpel. "This was never about race for me," he said, his tone steady, unreadable. "But ask yourself, would you be defending your son this hard if he were kicking someone who looked like you?" Rebecca's face drained of color. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her body went rigid, as if the weight of the question had landed on her shoulders all at once, pressing down with the force of something undeniable. Greg swallowed hard, his gaze flickering downward as if suddenly very interested in the fabric of his jeans. Lucas just looked confused. "What do you mean?" His voice, for the first time, carried a tinge of uncertainty. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists on her lap, and for a split second, it looked like she might argue, might lash out, might twist this into another excuse, another justification. But she didn't. She couldn't. Because everyone was watching. Because there was no way to spin it. Because she knew. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Dr. Carter held her gaze for another moment before finally exhaling, turning back to face forward, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking for an apology. He wasn't expecting some grand moment of revelation. He had learned long ago that people like Rebecca didn't change overnight. But maybe, just maybe, she would remember this. The cabin remained eerily still, the weight of the moment pressing down on every row. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, quietly, Lucas finally lowered his feet. Rebecca sat rigidly in her new seat, her body stiff as if switching places had physically wounded her. Her arms stayed crossed, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Lucas, now sandwiched between his parents, looked less triumphant than before. His legs no longer swung freely. His game console, once clutched like a lifeline, now rested in Greg's lap, confiscated without ceremony. For the first time since the flight began, there was silence. Elena let out a quiet breath, letting the tension settle, ensuring the shift had truly taken effect. Her years of experience told her that these kinds of moments could unravel just as quickly as they were stitched together. That anger had a way of morphing into self-righteousness. That silence could turn into retaliation. But no one spoke. No one dared. Greg ran a hand through his short, graying hair, glancing at Rebecca with a mixture of exhaustion and something dangerously close to embarrassment. His knee bounced slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but he didn't. Rebecca, meanwhile, remained motionless, her breathing controlled, her eyes unfocused as she stared at the seat back in front of her. Dr. Carter's words still clung to her like an oil stain she couldn't rub out. A long minute passed. Then another. Elena, satisfied that the issue had been resolved, for now, offered Dr. Carter a polite nod before stepping away. As she moved toward the galley, she overheard a passenger in the row behind Greg whisper to their seatmate, "Finally." She wasn't sure if they meant the silence or the accountability. Maybe both. Dr. Carter exhaled, his hands unclenching for the first time in what felt like hours. He reached for his tray table, unfolded it, and set his tablet down once more. This time it remained still. For the first time since the flight began, he had control over his own space. Across the aisle, a woman in her late 40s leaned slightly toward him, lowering her voice. "I just wanted to say, you handled that with more grace than I think most people would have." Dr. Carter gave her a polite but tired smile. Grace is survival skill. She seemed to understand exactly what he meant. From the corner of his eye, Dr. Carter caught movement. Lucas had turned slightly in his seat, his small hands fidgeting against his jeans, his body uncharacteristically still. He wasn't looking at his mother. He wasn't looking at his father. He was looking at him, not with defiance, not with irritation, with something else entirely. A kind of curiosity, a kind of realization. For the first time, Lucas seemed to truly see him. Dr. Carter didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The moment had already done what words never could. Rebecca kept her gaze locked straight ahead, her posture stiff, her breathing controlled. She refused to look at Dr. Carter, refused to acknowledge his presence, his patience, or the fact that for the first time on this flight, her son had finally stopped moving. The silence wasn't victory. It was suffocating. Passengers around them exhaled in relief, the collective tension loosening, but uneasiness lingered. The moment had passed, but its weight still sat heavy in the air, pressing against him in ways no one wanted to fully address. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming against his thigh. He reached for the in-flight magazine again, flipping the pages without focus, his eyes scanning words he wasn't actually reading. Every so often, he glanced toward Rebecca, as if waiting for her to say something, to justify what had just happened, but she didn't. Instead, she pulled her sweater tighter around herself and stared blankly at the seat back in front of her. Lucas, for all his energy earlier, was suddenly very still. His legs remained planted on the floor, his hands gripping the hem of his shirt. He wasn't sulking. He wasn't fidgeting. He was processing. For the first time, he wasn't just reacting. Across the aisle, a woman who had been following the situation discreetly finally leaned back in her seat, shaking her head slightly before whispering to her husband. I don't know how he stayed so calm. Her husband, a man with salt and pepper hair and a sharp, knowing gaze, let out a low hum of agreement. He shouldn't have had to. The words weren't meant for Dr. Carter, but he heard them. He had heard some version of them his entire life. His fingers hovered over his tablet, but he wasn't reading anymore. He was thinking, not about what had happened. He had always known it would play out like this, but about what it meant, about how many times people like Rebecca had never been forced to look at themselves as closely. He had no illusions about this being some grand moment of realization. He wasn't naive enough to think Rebecca would leave this flight and suddenly understand the world differently. But maybe, just maybe, Lucas would. The plane began its descent, the soft chime of the seatbelt sign cutting through the cabin. Passengers stirred, stretching their legs, shifting in their seats, preparing to return to their lives. But in row 14, no one moved. Dr. Carter remained still, his fingers resting lightly on the tablet he had barely touched. Rebecca's arms stayed folded, her face turned toward the window, as if willing herself to be anywhere but here. Greg, looking more drained than anything, rubbed his temples and muttered something under his breath. Lucas sat between them, silent, thoughtful in a way that felt unfamiliar. Then, just as Dr. Carter reached for his tray table, a small hand tugged at his sleeve. He froze, blinking in surprise. Slowly, he turned his head. Lucas stood beside him now, having maneuvered into the aisle just before the fastened seatbelt warning locked him in place. His posture lacked the usual carelessness he had carried throughout the flight. He looked uncertain. Without a word, he held out a crumpled piece of paper. Dr. Carter hesitated, then took it, carefully unfolding the wrinkled edges. It was a child's drawing, an airplane, scribbled in uneven lines, soaring between puffy clouds. And at the bottom, in shaky, uneven handwriting, were 3 words. I'm sorry. A small, unsteady exhale left Dr. Carter's chest. He glanced down at Lucas, who wasn't smirking now, wasn't testing limits. The boy's fingers twisted together, his blue eyes flicking up to meet Dr. Carter's, then darting away just as quickly. For the first time, Lucas looked unsure. Dr. Carter studied him for a long moment. He could have dismissed it, could have nodded curtly and let the boy return to his seat without another word. But something about the trembling effort behind those letters, behind the simple act of giving this to him, made him pause. Carefully, he folded the drawing and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Then, in a voice low enough that only Lucas could hear, he said, "Thank you." Lucas gave a small, jerky nod, then scurried back into his seat just as the plane touched down. For the first time since takeoff, Dr. Carter let out a real breath. 2 weeks later, Dr. Carter sat in his office, sifting through patient files, the steady hum of fluorescent lights overhead blending with the quiet murmur of hospital activity just beyond his door. It had been a long day, filled with difficult cases and even more difficult decisions, but his mind kept drifting, not to the surgeries, not to the diagnoses, but to Flight 327. He had told himself it was over, that the moment had passed like so many others before it. Yet it lingered, not because of Rebecca, not even because of Lucas, but because it was never just one moment. It was a pattern, an expectation, a reality he had learned to navigate with patience that shouldn't have been required of him in the first place. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Laura, stepped in, holding a manila envelope with no return address. "This came for you." Security checked it. "It's clear." Dr. Carter raised a brow but took it, nodding his thanks. As Laura left, he turned the envelope over in his hands, curiosity flickering through him. He tore the flap open and pulled out a letter on airline stationery. The first thing he saw was a signature at the bottom. Elena Vasquez. His lips pressed together, a faint, knowing exhale escaping his nose as he began to read. "Dr. Carter, I hope this letter finds you well. I debated whether to reach out, but after what happened on Flight 327, I wanted to share something with you. After submitting my report, I expected it to be filed away like so many others. Instead, something unexpected happened. The airline has decided to incorporate our interaction into our crew training, specifically how to recognize and address racial bias in passenger treatment." Dr. Carter's fingers tightened slightly around the paper. "I don't know if it will change much, but I wanted you to know that your patience, your restraint, your dignity in that moment, it didn't go unnoticed, and maybe, just maybe, it will make a difference for someone else down the line." A pause, a deep inhale. "I'm also including something that arrived at our customer service department, addressed simply as the doctor on the plane." Dr. Carter frowned slightly, reaching into the envelope again. His fingers brushed against the second folded paper. As he opened it, he recognized the shaky handwriting immediately. "Thank you for not being mean back." No name, just a drawing at the bottom. An airplane, scribbled in uneven lines. "Lucas." Dr. Carter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't everything. It wasn't justice. But it was something. How many times have we stayed silent when we should have spoken up? How many moments have passed where we saw something wrong, something unfair, and told ourselves it wasn't our place to intervene? Maybe we looked away, convinced that it wasn't our fight. Maybe we told ourselves that someone else would say something, someone else would handle it. But the truth is, change never happens in silence. Dr. Carter never planned to be part of a confrontation that day. He didn't board Flight 327 expecting to be tested. But that's the thing about injustice. It doesn't wait for the right time. It happens in ordinary places, in quiet moments, in situations where it would be so much easier to let it go. And for a long time, that's exactly what he did. He tried to ignore it. He weighed his options. He chose patience, because experience had taught him that patience was survival. But patience should never mean endurance at the expense of dignity. The truth is, Lucas wasn't the problem. He was a child, a reflection of what he'd been taught, or what he had never been taught. The real problem was the way Rebecca refused to hold him accountable, the way Greg disengaged, assuming it wasn't his responsibility to step in, the way passengers sat in uncomfortable silence, aware of what was happening but reluctant to intervene. And that's not just something that happened on a plane. That's something that happens everywhere. Racism, privilege, and entitlement don't always show up as loud, obvious moments of hatred. Sometimes they look like indifference. Sometimes they look like a child who knows he won't be punished. Sometimes they look like a mother who refuses to acknowledge why. So ask yourself this. If you had been on that plane, where would you have stood? Would you have been one of the passengers shifting uncomfortably in your seat, hearing every kick, watching the tension build, and hoping it would resolve itself? Would you have been the businessman who finally spoke up, not out of solidarity, but out of frustration? Would you have been Elena, willing to step into conflict, knowing that doing nothing meant allowing it to continue? Would you have been Rebecca, more concerned with being called out than with what was actually happening? Or would you have been Lucas, watching and learning what the adults around you chose to do? Because that's what this story is really about. Not about a flight, not about a single bad experience, but about what we teach each other through action and inaction. Justice isn't just in the big moments. It's in the small ones, too. The ones that happen 35,000 feet in the air, in the grocery store, in the workplace. It's in the moments where we choose to speak up or look away. It's in the moments where we challenge what's been normalized or allow it to continue. Maybe Rebecca will forget this ever happened. Maybe Greg will tell himself it wasn't a big deal. But Lucas will remember. He will remember that the man in front of him didn't get angry, didn't lash out, didn't retaliate. He will remember that an adult, someone who wasn't his parent, held him accountable. And maybe one day that will matter. The question is, when the moment comes, will you stand up or will you stay silent? This is more than a story. This is a challenge. What would you have done? Comment below.